Welcome. I'm Terry Henry. This is a new series for the Brocade Vyatta vRouter 5600. We're going to talk about installation and a few features and how to get them up and running. So today, the first in the series is how to get the 60-day trial downloaded, installed, and how to get the license installed so that you can, be the most effective in your 60 days of trialing this thing. So it can be installed either bare metal or in a VM. So if you're doing it bare metal, though, read the release notes, and there's only certain NIC cards that are supported. However, if we're running it in a VM, then we can just use the generic E1000 NIC driver or VMX Net 3. So however you want to do it. But for trial purposes, you might be just fine unless performance is, the most important criteria to you. But if features is the most important, then the virtual version will be just fine. Okay, so first things first, to download the trial version, we got to do a couple things. So if you go to the just go to brocade.com, and then under brocade.com, if you go to products and services, you go to software networking, and then you'll see Brocade vRouter. Now you could have just done a search for vRouter in the first place, right? But on the vRouter, you're going to see in the header here, you're going to see free trial right there. So you click on free trial, and it's going to give you a form to fill out. So it's, first name, last name, business email. So this is important. So first of all, you have to use a real email address because we're going to send you a license key, and you have to install that license key. Without that, it's going to expire in 24 hours. So make sure you use a real email address and a business email address. So if it turns out to be a Yahoo address or some kind of generic mailer, you're probably not going to get that license. So, and then your company name, phone number, and a country. You submit that, and what you're going to download is an ISO file, right? And so, if you were running it bare metal, you could use something like Power ISO and put that into a flash drive and boot it up that way. But, as I said, we are going to do this with VMware. Anyway, so after you've downloaded that, right, you're going to get an ISO file. You're going to save it somewhere in your machine. You're also they say within 5 hours of filling out this form, you're going to get an email with a license key in it. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to open. So I'm using VMware Workstation 12 Player. So this is for non-commercial use. And so, you would normally, probably in an enterprise network, you'd probably have a version of VMware Workstation full version, not the player. But if you don't have that, if you're doing it for home or something like that, just to play with it, then by all means use the player. So the player's free. You can go to VMware, you can download it. I'm not going to cover that today, but you download it, you run the setup, and it's going to lead you through a guided setup. But otherwise, it's a pretty fully functional virtual machine player. So what we're going to do is, I've got a few VMs already, but we're going to create a new one. So we're going to say create new virtual machine here. And what we're going to do is we're going to install it from disk because we've downloaded that ISO, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go into, if I remember where I put this thing. Right. So into Vyatta trial here, and then into the live. So I'm going to open this ISO, right? So it's a live CD. Now on the full version, if you paid for Vyatta, there is multiple versions in what you can download, right? So there's a KVM version, there's a VMware appliance version. There's multiple different versions that you can download, but for the trial, you're going to get the live CD. So we're going to open this live CD. So it's 5600 version 4.2 B1 R1B in this particular case. So we're going to select that and open it. Say next to this. Now, what kind of operating system is it? Well, it's a Linux based, right? So we're going to choose Linux, and then the version actually makes a difference. So we're going to choose Ubuntu 64-bit. And so some of the other versions will have their parameters set differently. So this is what I'm going to use to get up and running. So Ubuntu 64-bit. Now it's going to ask you what you want to call it. So you can call it whatever you want, but I'm going to call it something that makes sense to me. So Vyatta 5600 trial. Okay, now maximum disk size. So you need to choose at least 2 gigs of disk space in order for you to be able to install it. So you could choose less if you just wanted to run it off the trial version, but you want to install this. So we're going to choose 2 or more, depending on where you want to go, and then whether you choose to split those into multiple files or store it in a single. Again, that's up to you, totally up to you. So I'm gonna store it as a single file, 2 gigabits. Okay, now the other thing under customize hardware, we're going to change something else that's really important. So by default, for this version of Linux, it's allocating 1 gig of RAM. That is not enough. You need at least 2 gigs of RAM to start the data plane service, and without the data plane service, you don't have any interfaces. So you need to set this to at least 2 gigs. That's very, very important. Um, so set that to 2048. Now, more is better, right? If you got 16 gigs or 32 gigs in your physical machine, by all means, assign 4 gigs of memory or 8 gigs of memory, depending on what you're trying to achieve with your demo. But in my case, I just need 2 gigs to get it up and running. The other thing you may want to change is how it uses your NIC card, right? So by default, it's gonna use NAT. Okay, so um, it's gonna NAT that, so it's gonna use a private IP range and NAT it out. So what I want to do is I want to use a bridge connection because I want it to get a physical address from the subnet I'm on, and so that way I won't have to NAT it through my PC's address. So I'm gonna bridge that, and that should be all I need to change in there. So I've got 2 gigs of RAM, I got 2 gigs of disk space, and I've changed my network adapter to bridge. So that should be good enough. So I'm going to finish that, and there is my new Vyatta, right? Um, so it's created those files. Now, one other thing you may want to do is if you go into your virtual machine directory, which is where it would have created that virtual machine most likely, so it's going to be my documents, virtual machines, and here we have that VM I just created called Vyatta 5600 trial. Depending on what you called it, it'll be called differently. And then if we open the VMX file here, so VMX is only 2K, it's a small configuration file under VMware. If we're going to open that with Notepad, and you can't see it because it's on the wrong screen. There we go. So you can see all the parameters here for VMware. One of the things that is highly recommended you do, it'll work without it, but for a performance perspective, VMware says you shouldn't be using this E1000 driver. That's an old school gig driver. You should be using, for performance reason, you should change that to VMXNet 3, which is kind of a 10 gig driver and will give you better performance. So we're going to do that before we start it. Again, optional. E1000 would have worked. So we will get out of there, and then we're just going to play virtual machine. So this is going to bring up my VM here. Now, what's going to happen, of course, is this is a live CD version, right? So this is just booting off what it thinks is a virtual CD at the moment. So this is not installed onto that 2 gigs of disk space you gave it. This is just booting the VM. So it's going to take a second and boot that up. So being Linux based, right, it has to go through all its Linux startup services. There we saw the data plane service start right here. And this is what would have failed to start. So if I gave it less than 2 gigs of RAM, that data plane service right there would have failed to start. But because it has at least 2 gigs, it's good to go. It's going to start that up. Okay, and it's automatically going to log in as well because I'm on the live CD version. So there's no username and password, or at least it's going to automatically log me in from this live CD version. So the next thing we're going to do, I'm going to do a show interface and make sure I actually see an interface, which I do. So you see my interface here, DP0P160P1. So this is an interface, which it thinks is a physical interface in this case. It doesn't have an IP, and it's administratively or admin down at the moment, right? Which is how it starts by default. So in order to install that license key that you got in an email, we need this router to be online. It needs to be on the internet in order for it to validate that license key. So we need to bring that interface up. So first thing we're going to do actually is we're going to install the image first. Then we're going to add the license key. So just from this prompt here, you can do an install image, and it's going to walk you through this, right? So what do you want to name the image? Just you could choose the default, where you want to install it. Again, we're going to use the default. We're going to use the default partition type. Do you want to store the logs on a separate partition? We're going to say no. In production, you probably want to. We're going to have it auto partition. And then we're going to say yes to continue. So basically, we've just chosen all the defaults here. Other than the continue, it's going to create our partition on our 2 gigs. So it takes a couple seconds to install it. It's not long. There we go. And then it says what config file do you want to use. So the config boot default or config boot. So we're going to choose the default. Then it wants to know username and password, right? So we're just going to use Vyatta. And then it wants to know password. So obviously for production, you're going to use a proper password. So I'm going to use Vyatta, choose the defaults here, and then it's installed. Okay, so it is now installed onto that 2 gig partition. So once we reboot, we're going to reboot with grub as the bootloader as opposed to booting off of the CD version or the live CD version, right? So we're just going to do a restart here. Let's reboot it then. So proceed with reboot. Yes, it's going to reboot. So there's the grub loader right there, and it is now going to boot a version of VMware off of the hard drive. So once this gets done, the last steps are we need to go in and configure that interface because the interface is administratively down, right? So we're gonna bring that interface up. We're gonna actually tell it to get an IP through DHCP, um, and commit that configuration. And then we're going to add our license file, and then we'll be good to go for our 60-day evaluation period. So we're up and running. We're going to log in with Vyatta here, which is, depending on what you set that to. So here it's telling you, right? So it says a valid vRouter 5600 license is not detected, so you need to install one, and you need to install one within 24 hours, or it's going to shut down the services. So if we do a show version here, So it is vRouter 5600. It's running on an Intel 64-bit platform. Um, it's booted via the image, etc. So um, the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to go into configure. So this is different than a lot of our other products, and so a little bit different in the configuration. So it might take a little bit of a learning curve, but once you get it, it's pretty straightforward. So you see my prompt here change from the $ to £sign when I'm in configure mode. So question mark is always your friend, just like the rest of our products. So what can I do here? I can normally I have a much bigger list, right? So on a campus switch or on an MLXE or something like that, I have a much bigger list of things I can do here. But in this case, to set parameters, it's literally set, right? So we're going to do a set. And in this case, we're after the interface, right? So we're going to set interface. And under interface, I have a few options here. I have I could do a virtual tunnel interface or a tunnel interface or an open VPN interface or loopback. Or in this case, though, I'm doing data plane. I want a physical data plane interface. So the only interface I'm showing here is the DP0 P160P1. So you might be wondering where those numbers come from. So in the previous version, 5400, they were called ETH0, ETH1, ETH2, etc. Right? So in this case, they are bound to the hardware, basically. So if you make your Ethernet ports ETH0, ETH1, ETH2, and somebody inserts a new Ethernet card, it can throw off that numbering scheme, right? In this case, because it's bound to the hardware, that's not going to change just because you lose an interface or somebody adds a new interface, etc. So anyway, so we're just going to do DP and tab it because it's the only one we have. And then you have lots of options on what you can do here, right? So you can turn on firewalling, VPN, hardware parameter, routing parameters, etc. However, in this case, what we need to do is we need an address because we do not have an IP address on this guy. And you can physically assign an address, but in my case, I'm just going to do DHCP. Okay, so I've turned on DHCP. Now, one of the major differences between the Vyatta OS and our regular OS is I have to commit those changes. So in this case, I can make as many changes as I want, but none of them take effect until I commit them. So I am going to commit those changes. So it's actually, right now, it's actually bringing up that interface and trying to get an IP on it. So you see it's a starting DHCP client. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save that into the startup configuration. So I'm going to jump back out here and do a show interface again. And so now I have a 192.168.1.22 address, and I can see that my interface is now up and up, right? So before I did not have an IP and it was a min down. So as soon as I tell it to get an IP, I'm now good. I have an IP. I can probably ping my default gateway, hopefully. 192.168.1.1, which I can, so perfect. Okay, so the last step here before you go off on your 60-day trial is we're going to add our trial license, right? So we do an add, and under add here you can add a full license if you had one, but in this case we're going to add a trial license. We're going to do it online, and then it's going to, in the email that it would have sent you, it sent you a license key. So the last step you got to do here is just type in that license key. So type in the one I got in this particular case. And it's going to go out to the Brocade servers, authenticate that that license key is valid, and so now it says that the license request was successful. So from this point on, you now have 60 days to do whatever. So it is a fully licensed version at this point. And question mark is always your friend, right? So use question mark, you can use tab, just like you would on any of our other devices. The command line is a little bit different, and by all means, with that 60-day trial, you also get 60 days of support, so you can call TAC, and there's full documentation. So when you download the file, it's going to give you, or in that email, it's going to give you a link to the documentation, so you can download the full documents on how to enable various features, VPN, concentrator, firewall features, things of that nature. But that's it for today. You should be up and running, and that will get you started. All right. Thanks very much, and take care.